Today is November 24th, 2020. This is In Our Generation, where we look at the news from a Christian worldview. We will be looking at a few headlines today. First, I would like to recommend a podcast or a YouTube channel that I like to watch. It is Real Coffee with Scott Adams. You can find that by searching on YouTube for Real Coffee with Scott Adams. Scott Adams is the creator and illustrator of Dilbert. And he does a daily podcast where he talks a lot about politics, but a number of other things. I don't agree with Scott Adams on everything he says, and he certainly doesn't seem to be a Christian, but I like how he talks and I enjoy his podcasts. And so if you want to if you're on the lookout for a podcast that might be a little different than what you're used to hearing, I think his is quite interesting. One of the things that he says often is that he is not right wing. He says that he's left of Bernie, but better at math, which is funny, right? Because he's implying that Bernie's bad at math, and he's referring to Bernie Sanders, the politician. And Bernie is bad at math, at least in any way in which we can assess publicly. Yeah, he's bad at math. But what Scott Adams means by this, and this is what he says, is that he likes all the policies that Bernie Sanders recommends, or he likes all the ideas of Bernie Sanders. He likes the idea of people having health care, having education, helping the poor. He likes all of those things. The problem is that the way that Bernie Sanders wants to do it doesn't work mathematically, meaning there's no money for all these things. And that's what he means by he's better with math. And even though I like Scott Adams and I like a lot of the things he says, or I enjoy the things he says, I should say, this one thing he says in the way he describes himself is very disingenuous. It is tapping into the common misrepresentation of conservatives. The common misrepresentation of conservatives is that conservatives don't want people to have health care, that conservatives don't want people to be able to afford college, that they don't want people to be able to feed their families. That's ludicrous. I don't think there's any rational person in America who doesn't want people to be able to have these things. I mean, you'd have to be a complete sadist to actually not want people to be able to afford to take their children to the doctor. Everybody wants people to afford that. Conservatives desperately want people to be able to have these things. But we live in the real world, and in the real world, these things have to be paid for. I know we would like to think that pediatricians could make less money, could cost less. Let me put this way. Pediatricians could cost less than plastic surgeons. But you have to convince pediatricians to work for less. So when Scott Adams says that he likes Bernie's ideas, everybody likes Bernie's ideas. Bernie says, I want people to be able to afford college. Everybody likes that. Who doesn't like that? I want people to be able to afford health care. Everybody likes that idea. The question is, who's paying for it? Where's the money coming from? Are we going to force doctors to work for free? And once we do that, some of you might say, yes, definitely, let's force doctors to work for free. What about dentists? You say, yes, let's force dentists to work for free. They shouldn't be charging for this human right. Okay. What about house builders? Isn't having a home a human right for the socialists? Well, then shouldn't all construction workers be working for free? All sheetrockers be working for free? Should plumbers and electricians be working for free? Isn't plumbing a basic human right to have indoor plumbing and proper sewage treatment? So shouldn't all those people work for free? And isn't government a human right? Isn't good government a human right? So shouldn't all politicians work for free? Should anybody be paid for anything? Because that's what you're saying you need, that must happen, in order for all these ideas that we all love to come to fruition. People have to work for free. So who's going to work for free? Are you going to work for free? Well, this is the problem. Everybody's on board with getting everyone else to work for free or for less or to work cheap. And once we get people working for free or working cheap, what quality of product do you think we'll achieve? So then we got to have gulags and concentration camps where we lock up people who do not work well for free, who are not willing to do their utmost best when they work cheap. Everybody wants these things. So it's a misrepresentation to think that conservatives are people who don't want these things. Everybody wants them. Conservatives just know that you have to pay for them. You have to pay for them. So when Scott Adams says that he's with Bernie or he's left of Bernie, everybody's left of Bernie. Bernie is left of Bernie. Everybody is. The difference is how they get paid for. And so Scott Adams is actually on the right. He wants everyone to have everything they possibly could have and more, but he understands the reality of the world that it has to be paid for. I would like for everyone to have $10 million a day, to have a paycheck, let's say, of $10 million a day. In fact, why stop there? I think everybody should make $1 billion a day. Everybody should make $1 billion a day. That's what I want. I honestly do want that. I would like for everybody to buy a brand new car every day. I do want that. Why wouldn't I want you to have a new car? Do you think that I don't want you to have nice things? Of course I do. I want everybody I know, everyone I don't know. I want my worst enemy to have nice things. Wanting it, though, that's the left. Earning it, that's the right. So we're all left of Bernie in this sense. So no, Scott Adams, he likes to say that, but he's actually a conservative. And so kudos to him. The second thing I think we should talk about are the unintended consequences of the COVID epidemic. We can't talk about anything and not talk about COVID because it is absorbing our entire life and our existence. So let's talk a little bit about this. There are a number of unintended consequences coming along with the coronavirus. Back in March, when this started, I had a long discussion with a very close friend of mine, and they were a little bit peeved at me because they were on board with the lockdowns when they first started. The idea of shutting everything down for 2 weeks to flatten the curve and save the hospitals. And I was against that from the very beginning because my view is that once the government takes these kind of actions, there's no way to stop it. They began this with some idea of flattening the curve, which that in and of itself was very undefined. And so then how does that end? How does that stop? Where's the brake on that train? Well, I didn't see that they had installed brakes on the train. And so as long as there's anyone getting sick, as long as anybody is dying anywhere, that is sufficient cause to continue the same policies. Because politicians are incentivized to do something. They're never incentivized to do nothing. If a politician does nothing, then anything that does happen can be blamed on them because they did nothing. Whereas if they do something, anything, and that's kind of the mantra right now, right? Do something. As any little bit helps. Every little bit counts. That's the mantra. Because in politics, if you do something, no matter what happens, you can always say, if we hadn't done something, then it would have been much worse. And you can always accuse your political enemies that because they did nothing, it got worse. When in fact, that really is not necessarily true. And so I looked at how they were putting the wagons on the train together, And it looked to me like they had a whole lot of engines pulling the train, but they didn't have any brake cars. They had not established and said this amount of deaths is acceptable. In fact, quite the opposite. Every politician I ever heard said every death is unacceptable. Even one death is unacceptable. Now, I know that sounds right, and for anyone to say that that would be wrong, well, that just sounds terribly callous. But if we applied this to every aspect of our life, where would that lead us? Imagine if we said that even one highway death is unacceptable from a policy perspective. Well, then what policies will we implement if even one death is unacceptable? Well, we're going to make cars that are like 300 feet in diameter, built out of solid rubber, and you're going to be suspended in there on rubber bands, so that nobody can possibly die from an auto accident. We could set the speed limit to 3 miles an hour and force all the auto manufacturers to govern their engines down to 3 miles an hour, so that no matter what happens on a freeway, nobody dies. Sure, we could pursue a zero death policy. And I know that the transportation departments of the government pretend that that's what they do, but we don't pursue zero death policies. We pursue a balanced approach in which we balance how many people we're willing to see die to how badly we want to get to where we're going as quickly as possible. That's what speed limits are. They're trade-offs. Every mile per hour you reduce the speed limit, you save X amount of lives. It's actually quite a few. For a long time, the federal government wanted to set the national speed limit at 55 miles an hour. Now, there is no national speed limit, but the federal government has a lot of levers it can pull and has a lot of buttons it can push. And so it pressured the states to go along with a 55 mile an hour speed limit, because 55 mile an hour, at 55 mile an hour in a typical car, you have a much greater chance of surviving an accident than 70 miles an hour. And at 70, you have a better chance than at 90, and so on. And every mile of speed you pick up, you increase greatly your chances of dying in an accident. So we could pursue a zero death policy by reducing the speed limit down to ridiculous levels where nobody could get anywhere, where you'd be better off walking, and everyone could walk everywhere they go and not even have cars. And that would solve all kinds of problems, right? Which is where the beatniks would like to have us. But that's not the policy we're pursuing in any aspect of our life. And yet, when we looked at how the COVID response was going to be, it was going to be a response in which not one death was acceptable. And so as long as anybody is contracting the disease, as long as anybody is dying from it, then we must do something. What must we do? Every little bit counts. What that leads us to is unintended consequences. Now, everyone's talking about the obvious consequences of the disease, which is death and bad health and consequences, health consequences, long-lasting health consequences. But what about the unintended consequences? Do you realize that it is highly likely that more people are going to die from unintended consequences of COVID than from COVID itself? Does that count? Does that matter? It seems to me that we're willing to sacrifice millions of people's lives that will die as a direct consequence of our actions, of our response to this disease, in order to save hundreds of thousands of lives from COVID itself. Now, that's a trade-off we've decided to make as a society. We are going to sacrifice people that will die from suicide, that will die from starvation, which will be in the millions in some areas in the world. We are deciding to sacrifice people who are going to die because they could not receive the necessary treatment. I just read a news report from Poland that Poland, because of their of prioritizing COVID treatment, they are deprioritizing cancer treatments. And people who would normally be scanned and screened and tested and treated for early stages of cancer are not receiving that treatment. Now, how many people are going to die because they did not receive proper testing, proper early stage treatment for cancer? A lot. During the H1N1 epidemic in the UK, it is estimated that over 1 million people died from cancer-related issues that were unnecessary, that had they received early testing and early treatment, they would not have died. And so to save several tens of thousands of people from H1N1, we sacrificed 1 million people to cancer. And that's just cancer. What about diabetes? What about all the other types of diseases that come? What about all the obesity we're going to find when people have sat at home on their couch for 6 months and ate Cheetos? Well, these are all unintended consequences that come along with doing something. When you do something, when you enact policies, those policies not only have the intended consequences that you're aiming for, but they have unintended consequences. And often, those unintended consequences are worse than what you were trying to solve to begin with. And I suspect we're going to find that's the case with COVID. They've already done the math. Economists have done the math of how many people die for every percentage point that the GDP falls. And there is a number, which I don't have right now. I could have looked it up, but I didn't. You can look it up. But there's an actual number of people who will die when the GDP of a particular nation falls by a percentage point. So when we shut everything down and our GDP, or the GDP of some third world nation, which are more susceptible to this, falls by 5, 10, 15, 20%, that represents hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people dying who would not have died otherwise. All of these things have to be taken into account. That is not to say that I'm against or that I'm trying to speak against the protocols and the policies that are being implemented to combat the disease. Simply that it is not so simple, it is not so clean cut as to say, if we do something, it'll only get better. Every little bit solves something. That actually isn't true. Let's talk a little bit about the election. It just came out that Donald Trump is apparently, in a way, conceding. He is accepting that there is very likely no path to him to be able to win, regardless of what actually happened in the election. And so he has directed his staff to begin allowing a transition to the Biden administration. It's been my opinion since the beginning, right after the election, the night of the election, actually, that was the most likely outcome, was that Biden was going to win. I believe that either Trump was going to win very decisively on election night, or Biden would win. Now, I know that there's a lot of people, maybe a lot of you that listen to this program, who believe that that the election was stolen from Trump, and that there's tremendous fraud everywhere, widespread fraud, or egregious targeted fraud, however you want to phrase it, and that's what cost Trump the election, and that Trump actually won a landslide. Now, that may be true. I know there's some very smart people that are pretty convinced of that. I'm not convinced of it at all, for whatever that's worth. From the very beginning, I've been pretty convinced that Trump lost the election. In fact, I posted a meme, or I don't know, maybe it wasn't a meme. I posted a post, or maybe it was a tweet, about 3 or 4 weeks before the election, in which I said that Trump is not the victim of any grand conspiracy. Now, I'm not saying that there were no conspiracies. I'm not saying that the left did not engage in all forms of underhanded tricks, but that's not really what hurt Trump. Trump was not the victim of any grand conspiracy. Trump was the victim of serial seppuku. For those that don't know what that is and don't want to look it up, seppuku is ritual self-disembowelment performed by Japanese as an honor killing of themselves or honor suicide. When a Japanese samurai or Japanese warrior felt he had disgraced himself in battle by losing or other means, he would take his katana, I think that's what they call it, his little knife, and disembowel himself to avenge his own honor against himself. I think that's what happened to Trump. He continually disemboweled himself. He did a lot of great things as far as I'm concerned, especially when it comes to the judiciary. But he also pissed off a lot of people. And like it or not, you win elections by not making everybody hate you, by not making everybody wish you weren't on the ticket. Now, I realize that some of you, to even hear such a thing, is anathema to you. But there's a lot of people who felt that way. I felt that way. Now, I voted for Trump, but I held my nose both times. He was not the candidate I wanted. Recently, I was asked which candidate I actually would want, and I wasn't able to name any. So I don't actually have a candidate that I would have liked to see. So, I guess you got to contextualize what I'm saying within that thing. But I don't support abortion. And as far as I was concerned, Trump had done more against abortion than any president, I think, in modern history, even more than Reagan. So that's something. But there's a lot about Trump to not like, in my opinion. Now, you may like everything about him. In fact, you may be going out and getting yourself an orange spray tan to look just like him. I don't know. But there's a lot of things about Trump that I do not like. And had there been a primary candidate against Trump that I liked better, I would have voted for him in the primary. Probably. Although the judiciary and the abortion issue made me quite a loyalist despite my misgivings. But anyways, so going back to the point, you may have thought that there was tremendous fraud in the election. And there may have been. I'm not convinced of that. I think Trump lost the election. I think Biden and his strategists realized that all he had to do was keep his mouth shut and let Trump run his, and that would grant and that he could win the election by doing that. And I think that's what Biden's strategy was. People were mad. People mocked Biden for calling a lid every day, not speaking to the press, not being seen or heard, having these tiny little gatherings of people where he gave his little speeches and bumbled and stumbled over everything. And you wonder, why doesn't he get out and talk to more people? Why would he? Trump, every time he opened his mouth, was giving him the election. Many people predicted that, not just me. And if you want to see it in the numbers, why Trump lost the election, this isn't fraud. Now, there may have been some fraud, and maybe it affected one state, maybe it affected two. I don't think there was sufficient fraud to actually change the result in 5 states that Trump needed to win. I think that's a wacky conspiracy theory, although I think that the American election process is rife with fraud and ripe for fraud and needs to be overhauled dramatically. All that's true, and yet I don't see the evidence of enough fraud in these states to overcome the numbers that we see of why Trump lost. And I don't mean how many votes were cast and how many people voted for Biden and what percentages he won in each state. Trump increased his percentage in every demographic except for one. So he got far more black votes, far more Hispanic votes, more female voters voted for him than in 2016. So if you compare Trump's numbers from 2020 to 2016, Trump increased his vote share in every single demographic except for one: white men. White men by 5% walked away from Trump. Do you understand how impactful that is? What that means? Let me give it to you in the numbers. In 2016, 33% of the electorate were white men. 33% of the electorate voted for Trump in the form of white men. If he loses 5% of that, that is the equivalent of going from 46 million votes to 39 million votes. That's 7 million votes. Nobody's alleging fraud there. Nobody's saying that 5%, that 7 million white male votes were fraudulently taken from Trump. That's not what happened. 7 million white male voters walked away from Trump. Now, I don't think that is all because they decided that they all of a sudden had a change of heart of who they're going to vote for, because we find out that down ticket, they continued to vote Republican. So why did so many white men, and not just white men in this case, but many other demographics of voters also did the same thing? Why did they vote Republican for every other thing and vote against Trump? Now, you could say that that's fraud, but then why, if they are changing the votes for president, why wouldn't they change the vote for senator and for congressman and for judges? Why only for president? In fact, why for president at all? It'd be a lot less dangerous to commit that type of fraud at these lower level races that no one's really going to look at too closely. But for president, the brass ring of races, the most significant race, to commit that kind of fraud and leave all the rest of the ballot alone? If you're going to change a ballot, why not change it all the way? Doesn't it look kind of suspicious to do it that way? Obviously, conspiracy theorists will say, well, that's how they intended polls. Everything goes along with this. Everything goes along with this. All the numbers we have, everything we find, it points to that this legitimately happened. So why did white male voters, walk away from Trump? Well, there's a lot of reasons. I think that one of the reasons is that white male voters, many of them, like myself, had to weigh how important it would be for Trump to win from a policy perspective. What is lost if Trump loses, especially if they can maintain the Senate and pick up some seats in the House? So have a divided government. And what do they lose if Trump wins? Well, if you weigh that like I did, it's very hard to make the case that it's not better for Trump to lose and the Republicans to win everywhere else. Because of all the rioting, because of all the violence that was being threatened. Now, I'm not blaming Trump for that. I think that this is I think that this is the actual fraud that took place. That even if, but the fraud that took place was that I believe, and I'm not convinced that this was conspiracy or that this was organized at any high level, but rather it was just intuitive of these spoiled brats that we've raised in our society who know that by throwing temper tantrums, especially the grown-up version of a temper tantrum with Molotov cocktails and burning things down and looting and breaking up buildings, that there were going to be many people who were going to say it simply is not worth the trouble. If Trump wins, we're going to be looking at months, if not years, of this civil unrest. And how is it going to be solved? And you can say, well, people should get out their guns and they should go defend their property and do what? Start shooting people? Even if you think that rioters deserve it or that looters coming onto your private property and destroying your everything you've worked on your life for, that they deserve to be shot, are you going to be the one to shoot them? Are you going to be the one to get handcuffs put on you because you killed somebody? Justified or not? Justified or not, you'll probably be arrested. You'll probably go to court. You'll probably have to hire an attorney. It'll probably break you, bankrupt you. So are you going to be the one to do that? Am I going to be the one to do that? That's why nobody's defending themselves. And those that are, they're in jail. Now, you may not like it, and you may think that they have a right to that defense, and maybe they do. But who is actually going to stand up and shoot everybody? I'm not. And so what are you going to do? Well, you're going to seriously consider that maybe the less painful way out of all this is just to walk away from Trump. And I think that a lot of white men, in fact, I think a lot of men in general, made exactly that decision. I think Hispanic men, black men, white men, I think a lot of people who wanted to support Trump, that wanted to vote for him for his policies, for issues like abortion, for free trade and other things like that, I think that a lot of them just walked away because they realized the kind of predicament they were going to be put in and the type of fight they would have to put up on the streets, in their neighborhoods, in their cities, in their downtown areas. And they just did not, they did not have the stomach for it. And I don't blame them. Now, I still voted for Trump, but I don't blame anybody who looked at that and assessed that and said, I just do not want to put up with this. Now, I don't think it's going to solve anything. All we've done is kick this can down the road. The spoiled brats have learned a lesson. And they've learned that if they throw a big enough temper tantrum, then they can get their way. So the next time they don't get their way, what do you think they're going to do? Those of you that weighed that and decided that electing Trump was too much hassle, was going to result in too many problems, what do you think is going to happen the next time these spoiled brats don't get their way? Do you think they're going to cut you a break? They're going to say, okay, you let us have one. Now it's your turn to have one. I don't think so. I think all we've done is embolden them. All we've done is harden them. So I think that was a fraud that was committed. I think all the rioting, the looting, the social unrest discouraged millions of people who would have otherwise voted for Trump to not vote for him to save themselves all that hassle. And if you could actually prove that there was a grand conspiracy to achieve that, it still wouldn't change the election. This is, in my view, the brilliance of this electoral fraud. That even if you could prove it in a court of law, it would not undo the election. Biden would still be president. Now that is good fraud. Changing ballots and hacking machines, if that can be proven, it all gets undone. This, riling up some spoiled brat kids to go out and firebomb some cities, you can arrest them all, put them all in jail, and Biden is still president. You can get the ringleader to confess that the goal was to intimidate the electorate, and Biden's still president. Because there's not a single vote you can point out and say that vote is fraudulent. Because everyone voted what they wanted to vote. Everyone voted for what they saw was important. So that's the actual election fraud that I think took place. Very good. I guess that's all